At exactly 9:42 in the morning on September 15th, 1944, Private First Class Ethan Cole crouched in the jagged white coral of the Brogal pocket and watched a Japanese officer kill his friends from half a mile away. The heat on Peleliu was already 115 degrees. It was a wet, suffocating blanket that made the air shimmer like water boiling on a stove. The kind of heat that turned metal too hot to touch and made men's brains cook inside their helmets until they stopped thinking clearly and started making mistakes. But Ethan did not feel the heat. He only felt the sharp edge of the coral digging into his knees and the heavy thud of mortar rounds walking up the valley floor like the footsteps of an angry god. 400 yards ahead, the jungle had been stripped away by naval gunfire. What remained was a moonscape of white rock and black ash, no trees, no cover, just dead ground where Marines were dying. And standing on a limestone ridge exactly 800 yards to the north was the man responsible for the butchery. The Japanese officer stood in plain sight. He was not hiding. He was not crawling through the mud or pressing himself flat into a bunker. He stood tall, wearing a pressed uniform that looked impossibly clean against the grey rock. He held a pair of binoculars in one hand and a map case in the other. To the exhausted, bleeding Marines of the 1st Division, this man looked like a ghost, or maybe a god. He would raise his hand, point to a cluster of rocks, and 10 seconds later, a Japanese mortar team hidden on the reverse slope would drop a shell right on top of a Marine fire team. 6 men dead, just like that. He was conducting an orchestra of violence with absolute impunity. He knew exactly where the Americans were, and more importantly, he knew exactly what weapons they carried. The standard American infantry rifle in 1944 was the M1 Garand. It was a semi-automatic masterpiece, rugged and reliable, capable of firing 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger. But the Garand had a limit. Its effective range was 500 yards. Beyond that distance, the iron sights covered up the entire target and the bullet began to tumble and drift. The Japanese officer was standing at 800 yards. He had done the math. He knew he was untouchable. He knew no American rifle could reach him from that distance. But Ethan Cole had done the math too, and his math was better. Ethan turned his back on the ridge and dragged a long, heavy canvas case out from under a rain-soaked tarp. The case was covered in green mold and wet sand, but the contents inside remained pristine. He unbuckled the leather straps with fingers that trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from something else. Anticipation, maybe, or the weight of a promise made 2 years ago over a closed casket draped in an American flag. He pulled out a weapon that looked like it belonged in a museum, or perhaps a circus. It was a 1903 Springfield, a bolt-action relic from the First World War. The same rifle his father had carried through the trenches of France in 1918. The same rifle that had hung above the fireplace in their small house in Hickory Corners, Michigan, until the day Ethan left for boot camp. But it was not the rifle that made the other men in the trench stop cleaning their wounds and stare. It was the scope mounted on top of it. The scope was an unearthly 8-power target optic, and it was absolutely massive. The steel tube was 24 inches long, nearly the same length as the rifle barrel itself. It sat high above the receiver on delicate aluminum mounts that looked like they had been assembled from an erector set. The whole contraption looked less like a tool of war and more like a piece of laboratory equipment. A fragile glass pipe that would shatter if you breathed on it too hard. The men in the trench looked at the rifle. Then they looked at Ethan. Then they laughed. It was a dark, bitter laughter. The kind that comes from men who have seen too much death in too short a time to believe in magic anymore. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Brennan shook his head and spat a long stream of tobacco juice onto the white coral. The brown liquid sizzled in the oppressive heat. "You planning to study the stars, Cole?" His voice was rough, worn down by years of shouting orders over gunfire. "Or maybe hunt for butterflies?" Brennan was 34 years old, a Kentucky coal miner's son who had lied about his age to enlist in 1927. He had seen combat in Nicaragua and China. He had buried more young Marines than he cared to count. 6 months ago at Tarawa, he had watched his own son die on the beach. The boy had been shot through the chest while running toward a pillbox. He had been 19 years old. Now Brennan looked at Ethan Cole, this 20-year-old college boy from Michigan with his mail-order toy, and saw another young man about to get himself killed for no good reason. "That's a mail-order toy, son." Brennan pointed at the massive scope with his chin. "That glass tube will fog up in 5 minutes in this humidity, or the first speck of grit will jam the sliding mechanism. Put the toy away and pick up a real rifle before you get yourself killed." Corporal Silas Thornton chimed in from across the trench. He was 32 years old, a father of 3 from West Virginia. His hands were scarred from years of working coal seams in the dark. "Kid brought a telescope to a knife fight." He shook his head without humor. "What's next?" "You're going to calculate the trajectory with a slide rule." The other Marines laughed again. For the past 3 weeks, they had been fighting in caves and spider holes, engaging the enemy at ranges of 10 feet. Sometimes 5, sometimes close enough to smell the fear on each other's breath. The idea of a precision instrument in this meat grinder was offensive to them, insulting even. Ethan ignored them all. He knew what they saw. They saw a delicate, finicky instrument that had no business in the mud and blood and coral dust. They saw a liability, a college boy playing scientist while real Marines were dying all around him. But Ethan saw something else entirely. He saw the only weapon on the entire island capable of bridging the gap between this trench and that ridge. He saw mathematics made flesh. He saw the answer to a problem that conventional infantry rifles could not solve. He had learned this mathematics on a cold November morning 16 years ago in the woods outside Hickory Corners. The memory came to him unbidden, sharp and clear despite the years. He was 14 years old, standing in frost-covered leaves with his father beside him. William Cole was a quiet man who had survived the trenches of France and never talked about what he had seen there. But he understood rifles, and he understood mathematics. "Math doesn't kill the deer, Ethan." His father's voice was soft, but certain, barely louder than the wind in the bare trees. "But math tells you where to aim." They were hunting a white-tailed buck at 300 yards. Young Ethan had calculated everything with the intensity of a boy trying to impress the man he admired most in the entire world. 300 yards to the deer, 10-mile-per-hour crosswind coming from the west. He had done the arithmetic in his head, factoring in the bullet drop and the wind drift. "Hold 18 inches left, 8 feet high." His father had smiled then. It was the kind of smile that said he was proud without having to speak the words out loud. The kind of smile that Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. "Show me." Ethan had fired. The deer had dropped instantly, a perfect heart shot clean and quick and merciful. That night, sitting by the fire in their small house, his father had pulled out this very rifle, the rifle he had carried through the mud and blood of France. The metal was scratched and worn. The stock was dinged with 100 memories that his father never talked about. "I killed Germans with this at 400 yards. His voice was quiet and distant, as if he were speaking more to the fire than to his son. "Iron sights. Guesswork. I missed more than I hit." He had looked at Ethan then, and there was something in his eyes that the boy did not fully comprehend. A kind of weight, a kind of knowledge that could only come from seeing things no man should ever have to see. "Imagine what you could do with glass, Ethan. Imagine what you could do if you could see them before they saw you." Ethan had never forgotten that conversation. Every word was burned into his memory like a brand. And when his father died on Guadalcanal in late summer of 1942, killed by a Japanese sniper he never saw coming, Ethan had made a promise. Standing over the closed casket at the funeral home in Hickory Corners, he swore he would finish what his father started. He would learn to use the glass. He would become the calculator his father always knew he could be. He had enlisted the next day. He was 18 years old. He had taken his father's Springfield and every penny he had saved and ordered the Unertl scope through the mail. 8-power magnification, 24 inches of precision German glass. It cost more than his mother made in 6 months working at the textile mill. At Camp Pendleton in California, while the other Marines were drinking and playing cards, Ethan was on the range. 10,000 rounds, 10,000 calculations, zeroing the scope, learning the holdovers, memorizing the tables. 800 yards, 900 yards, 1,000. The armorers thought he was insane. The drill instructors thought he was wasting his time. Nobody made shots past 500 yards in combat. It was mathematically possible, but tactically irrelevant. Until now. Now, on Peleliu, with the Japanese officer standing untouchable on that distant ridge, the mathematics were the only thing that mattered. Ethan set the rifle down on a stack of rotting sandbags and began his work with the focused calm of a watchmaker assembling a delicate timepiece. He wiped a tiny smudge of oil from the ocular lens with a dry cloth he kept in a waterproof pouch. He checked each mount screw, tightening them with painful precision. The scope was so long that he could not simply rest the gun on a rock like you would with a normal rifle. The tube would strike the obstacle before the barrel did. Everything had to be carefully positioned. Sergeant Brennan watched him work, still shaking his head in disapproval. "The damn officer will be gone by the time you finish playing with your science project, Cole. War is not a math problem, kid." But Ethan knew that war was exactly a math problem. It was a problem of trajectories and velocities and angles. It was a problem of constants and variables. Gravity was always pulling, wind was always pushing, temperature changed the density of air, humidity affected bullet flight. But the mathematics never lied. The mathematics did not care if you were scared or brave. It did not care if you believed in it or not. The math simply was. Ethan pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket. It was water-stained and wrinkled, the pages swollen with humidity, but the pencil marks were still legible. He flipped to a page marked 800 yards and ran his finger down a column of numbers he had written out months ago during training. Then he pulled out a stub of carpenter's pencil and wrote directly on his left forearm, just below where his sleeve was rolled up against the oppressive heat. 800 yards, plus 28 clicks elevation, right 4 clicks windage. The Japanese officer was standing 800 yards away. The .30 caliber bullet from the Springfield would leave the muzzle traveling at 2,800 feet per second, fast enough to punch through steel plate, fast enough to kill a man before he heard the sound of his own death approaching. But gravity was a constant, relentless force. Over that distance, the bullet would not fly in a straight line. It would arc. It would rise and then fall, dropping out of the sky like a stone thrown from a tall bridge. At 800 yards, the bullet would drop more than 100 inches, more than 8 feet. Ethan would have to aim nearly 9 feet above the officer's head just to hit him in the chest. He would have to lob the round into the air like a mortar shell and trust gravity to bring it back down at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place. It was not shooting in the conventional sense. It was mathematics made lethal. It was faith in numbers that most men could not even comprehend. Ethan lay down behind the rifle. He pulled the wooden stock into his shoulder, feeling the familiar solid weight of it pressing against his collarbone. He placed his cheek against the comb and peered through the glass. The world rushed toward him. The 8-power magnification cut through the distance like a knife through butter. It erased the heat waves and the smoke. It collapsed space and time. Suddenly, the Japanese officer was not a small, blurry figure on a distant ridge. He was right there, close enough to touch. Ethan could see the buttons on his tunic. He could see tiny beads of sweat on his forehead. He could see the way his lips moved as he shouted orders to his men below. The officer's face was young, maybe 30. He had thin lips and sharp cheekbones. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow barely visible. The mockery from the trench faded away into background noise. The laughter of Sergeant Brennan did not matter anymore. The doubt of the other Marines became irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the crosshair floating in the center of the glass tube, that single point of intersection where mathematics met reality. The officer on the ridge turned slightly. He seemed to look directly down the valley, staring right at Ethan's position, as if he could see through the rocks and smoke and death. But he could not see the Marine. He could not see the rifle. He only saw a pile of coral and dead trees and broken ground. He smiled. It was a confident, arrogant smirk that said he was the master of this battlefield, that he was untouchable, that he was God himself. He raised his hand slowly, preparing to signal another mortar volley, preparing to kill more Americans who had no way to reach him, no way to stop him. Ethan placed the crosshair on a point in empty space, approximately 9 feet above the officer's head. He was aiming at pure sky, at nothing but air and faith. He exhaled slowly, letting the air out of his lungs until they were almost empty. His finger found the trigger. The metal was smooth and cool against his skin. The trigger on the 1903 Springfield broke like a thin rod of glass. It was crisp, sudden, and terrifyingly light. There was no creep, no warning, just the immediate release of the firing pin spring. The rifle slammed back into Ethan's shoulder with shocking violence. It was a sharp, angry kick, far worse than the gas-operated push of a Garand. But Ethan did not feel the bruise already forming on his collarbone. He did not feel the pain. He was too busy watching through the scope. This was the moment the infantrymen did not understand. They thought a scope was just a magnifying glass glued to a gun. They did not know about the slide. They did not understand the engineering marvel that made this shot possible. When the rifle fired, the recoil drove the wooden stock backward against Ethan's shoulder with tremendous force. But the heavy steel tube of the unearthed scope wanted to stay exactly where it was. Basic physics took over. The scope actually slid forward inside its aluminum rings, moving nearly 3 inches along the length of the barrel. It looked like a piston on a steam engine. It was a bizarre, jarring mechanical action that made it look like the gun was falling apart. If Ethan had been using a rigidly mounted modern scope, the recoil would have driven the eyepiece straight into his eye socket hard enough to blind him. But the unearthly slid forward away from his face, absorbing the brutal shock and keeping the delicate lenses safe from the violent energy of the .30-06 cartridge. Ethan kept his eye pressed to the rubber eyepiece. He reached up with his left hand and manually pulled the scope back into battery, sliding it rearward until it clicked solidly into its starting position. It was muscle memory. He had practiced 10,000 times on the range at Camp Pendleton. Shoot, slide, reset, repeat. He did not blink. He could not afford to blink even once. The bullet was still in the air, traveling across 800 yards of empty space at impossible speed. At a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, the round covered the first few hundred yards almost instantly. But as it flew, the air grabbed at it like invisible hands trying to slow it down. The drag increased exponentially. Gravity pulled at it relentlessly, bending its path toward the earth. The bullet took 1.4 seconds to cross the 800-yard valley. That might sound like a heartbeat. A blink. Nothing at all. But in a gunfight, 1.4 seconds is an eternity. It is enough time to take a full breath. It is enough time to doubt every calculation you have ever made. It is enough time for the target to bend down to tie his boot and ruin everything you have planned. Ethan watched the ridge through the magnified circle of light. Time seemed to slow down. The world narrowed to a single point of focus. The Japanese officer was still smiling. He was mid-sentence, his hand raised high above his head to point at the marine lines below, and then the physics equation solved itself. The officer simply collapsed. There was no dramatic flailing, no movie-style backward flip, no theatrical gesture. It looked like someone had suddenly cut all the strings on a marionette. The man just folded in on himself and dropped straight down behind the limestone lip of the ridge. The pink mist that snipers sometimes talked about was not visible at this distance, not even with 8-power magnification. There was just the sudden jarring absence of the man who had been playing God 10 seconds earlier. The sound of the shot finally rolled back across the valley. A flat, heavy crack that echoed off the coral walls and faded into the thick jungle air. Then silence. Absolute heavy silence that pressed down on everything like a physical weight. The Japanese mortar crew on the reverse slope waited patiently for an order that would never come. The machine gun position to the left stopped firing, confused by the sudden disappearance of their commander. They did not understand what had just happened. They did not know their officer was dead. In the American trench, the Marines, who had been mocking Ethan 10 minutes earlier, were frozen in place like statues. They lowered their binoculars slowly, as if moving through thick water. They looked at the ridge where the officer had been standing just moments before. Then they looked at the toy rifle resting on the sandbags with its ridiculous glass pipe catching the harsh Pacific sunlight. Sergeant Brennan stood up very slowly, his weathered mouth hanging slightly open. He looked at the impossible distance. Then he looked back at the skinny 20-year-old kid with the mail-order telescope. The mockery evaporated instantly like water dropped on a red-hot stove. It was replaced by a look of confusion that slowly hardened into something close to fear. Not fear of Ethan himself, but fear of what Ethan represented. The idea that war could be reduced to pure mathematics, that death could be calculated like a simple trigonometry problem, that a man could be erased from existence by numbers written on a forearm in pencil. Ethan did not celebrate. He did not look up for acknowledgement or praise from the men around him. He simply reached for the bolt handle with the mechanical efficiency of a factory worker on an assembly line. This was the other significant drawback of the Springfield. It was painfully slow. With a Garand, you just kept pulling the trigger, and the rifle did all the work. With this bolt-action relic from another era, you had to physically unlock the breech, drag the spent casing out, and manually shove a fresh round home. Ethan worked the action with the palm of his right hand. It was a smooth, deliberate motion he had practiced 10,000 times until it became automatic. The empty brass cartridge spun out of the ejection port and pinged against the white coral rock with a sound like a small bell ringing. He drove a fresh round into the chamber from the internal magazine and locked the bolt down with a solid metallic clunk that echoed in the sudden silence. He was ready again, ready to calculate, ready to kill. Brennan moved across the trench slowly, no longer laughing, no longer skeptical, no longer treating Ethan like a naive college boy playing soldier. He knelt beside him, and when he finally spoke, his voice had completely changed. It was quieter now, respectful, almost reverent. "How far was that shot, Cole?" 800 yards, Sergeant." Brennan stared at him for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable in the harsh tropical sunlight. He was processing what he had just witnessed, trying to understand something that violated everything he thought he knew about infantry combat. "And you just calculated it in your head?" "Yes, Sergeant. Math doesn't lie." Brennan continued to stare, his mind working through the implications. Then he slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled pack of Lucky Strikes. He shook one cigarette loose and offered it to Ethan with a hand that trembled slightly. This was significant, deeply significant. Sergeant Marcus Brennan shared his cigarettes with absolutely no one. Not since Tarawa. Not since he had smoked his last lucky strike with his son on the transport ship the night before the landing, telling the boy stories about Kentucky and promising him they would go fishing together in the Cumberland River when the war was finally over. Ethan took the cigarette, though he did not smoke, and never had. It was not about the cigarette itself. It was about the gesture. It was about being accepted by a man who had seen more death than any human being should ever have to witness in a single lifetime. "Kid," Brennan said quietly, lighting both cigarettes with a battered Zippo that had clearly seen better days. "I was wrong about you." Ethan nodded once, accepting the apology that was buried in those simple words. He took a single drag of the cigarette, immediately coughed from the harsh smoke, and set it down carefully on the sandbag. His eyes never left the scope for more than a few seconds. 3 minutes later, a Japanese NCO crawled up to the ridge to check on the fallen officer. He was careful, well-trained. He stayed low, keeping his head down, moving with the practiced caution of a veteran soldier who had survived this long by never taking unnecessary risks. But he made one critical mistake. He stopped to look through the dead officer's binoculars, trying to locate the American positions and understand what had just happened to his commander. He exposed his head and shoulders for exactly 5 seconds. Ethan was already waiting. Patient, calm, ready. He had pre-aimed at the exact spot where the officer had fallen. The crosshair was hovering over the white limestone, steady and unmoving. When the helmet appeared above the ridgeline, Ethan did not have to calculate anything new. He did not have to adjust for wind or temperature or distance. The math was already done. He just had to squeeze. The second shot cracked through the humid Pacific air. The recoil slide kicked back violently. The scope reset automatically under Ethan's experienced hand. The NCO did not even hear the sound that killed him. The heavy .30 caliber bullet punched through his helmet like it was made of paper and knocked him backward off the ridge like a child's toy swept away by an angry hand. 2 shots, 2 kills, both at half a mile, both with mathematical precision. This time the reaction in the American trench was completely different. Brennan did not stare in confusion or disbelief. He immediately scrambled over the jagged rocks and positioned himself beside Ethan like a bodyguard protecting the President of the United States. He barked sharp orders at the other Marines to keep their heads down, to not draw fire toward Ethan's position, to stay low and stay quiet and stay alive. He offered Ethan his canteen. He offered him a stick of Wrigley's spearmint gum from his personal stash. Suddenly the college boy with the mail-order toy had become the most valuable asset in the entire platoon, maybe the entire battalion. Brennan began pointing out targets like a man directing traffic at a busy intersection. A machine gun nest dug into a cave mouth at 600 yards. A sniper hide partially concealed in a burned breadfruit tree at 500 yards. A mortar team setting up behind a coral ridge at 700. He was feeding information to the calculator. And the calculator was solving problems that artillery could not reach and that conventional infantry could never touch. Ethan went to work with cold efficiency. For the next hour, he conducted a brutal clinic in long-range destruction. A machine gunner silhouetted against a cave entrance at 650 yards. 2 officers conferring behind what they thought was adequate cover at 720 yards. A sniper in a tree who made the fatal mistake of shifting position at 580 yards. He was not just killing individual men anymore. He was systematically dismantling their entire defensive network, one calculated shot at a time. He was destroying their ability to coordinate, their ability to communicate, their ability to function as a cohesive military unit. The unearthly scope, with its absurd length and seemingly fragile mounts, was proving to be the perfect tool for the static grinding warfare of Peleliu. The high magnification allowed him to see deep into the shadows of the limestone caves, to spot the brief muzzle flash of a hidden rifle, to pick out the edge of carefully arranged camouflage netting that blended almost perfectly with the jungle backdrop. By mid-afternoon, Ethan had moved to a new position. The Japanese were not stupid. They would be looking for him now, searching for the sniper who had killed their officers and systematically dismantled their defensive positions with surgical precision. He set up behind a different pile of coral 100 yards from his original hide. He carefully stacked sandbags to support the long rifle, making absolutely certain the unearthly tube had proper clearance so it would not strike anything during the violent recoil cycle. At 1500 hours, he spotted movement on the second ridgeline, a bunker complex barely visible through the heat shimmer, 900 yards away, built into the reverse slope of a ridge that the Marines could not approach without walking directly into a meat grinder of interlocking machine gun fire. Ethan studied it through the scope. The bunker was marked by a reinforced gun port cut through thick concrete. He could see sandbags stacked in a careful L shape. He could see the dull glint of metal where a machine gun barrel protruded through the narrow opening. He waited. 30 minutes passed. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into something you had to push through to breathe. Sweat ran into his eyes, and he blinked it away with slow, careful movements. Then a figure appeared in the bunker entrance, just for a moment. A brief flash of movement. An officer, judging by the cut of the uniform. He was shouting orders to someone inside the bunker, gesturing sharply with a leather map case clutched in his right hand. 900 yards. Bullet drop would be approximately 230 inches. That was just over 19 feet. Ethan dialed in the elevation. 28 clicks up on the scope's adjustment knob. Wind correction of 3 clicks right to account for the quartering breeze. He placed the crosshair on a point in empty space approximately 18 feet above where the officer's head had been moments before. He was aiming at pure sky, at nothing but air and faith, at a point in space that existed only in his calculations. The officer reappeared in the bunker entrance, still shouting orders, still gesturing with the map case, still completely unaware that death was being calculated 900 yards away. Ethan squeezed the trigger with steady, even pressure. The Springfield roared, the familiar violent recoil, the scope sliding forward and back. Ethan worked the bolt automatically, muscle memory taking over, and kept his eye pressed to the rubber eyepiece. Through the glass, he watched as the officer suddenly stumbled backward into the darkness of the bunker, like a man who had been struck by an invisible fist. The map case flew from his hand and landed in the white coral outside the entrance. 2 seconds of absolute silence passed. Then the bunker complex erupted with chaotic activity. Men poured out of the entrance like ants from a disturbed hill. They were confused, disorganized, leaderless. Their hands were empty of weapons. They looked around frantically, trying to understand what had just happened to their commander. And then something occurred that Ethan had not expected, something that would change the entire dynamic of the battle. A white flag appeared, a piece of torn cloth tied hastily to a rifle barrel, waving frantically from the bunker entrance like a desperate signal. Brennan grabbed the radio handset so fast he nearly dropped it. "Actual, this is Brennan. Enemy position grid 447229 is showing white flag. I repeat, white flag. Request instructions. Over." The radio crackled back immediately. The voice on the other end sounded as disbelieving as Brennan felt. "Verify and hold position. Sending patrol to accept surrender. Over." Over the next 20 minutes, 47 Japanese soldiers emerged from that bunker complex with their hands raised high above their heads in surrender. 47 men who had been trained since childhood. That surrender was the ultimate dishonor. 47 men who would have fought to the absolute death under normal circumstances. All of them walking out into the harsh sunlight because their commander was gone. Erased by a bullet that had dropped from the sky at such a steep angle they initially thought it was artillery fire. A young Marine lieutenant arrived at Ethan's position an hour later. He looked maybe 23 years old at most, but his eyes were much older. The eyes of a man who had aged a full decade in the past 3 weeks. "Corporal Cole." The lieutenant's voice was tight with something between respect and disbelief. "The prisoners say their commander was killed by a sniper. They thought it was artillery at first because the angle was so steep." He paused, looking at the rifle with its massive glass tube. "How far was that shot?" 900 yards, sir." The lieutenant shook his head very slowly, as if trying to dislodge water from his ears. "That's not possible. The manual says maximum effective range is 900 yards, but nobody actually makes those shots. Not in combat. Not for real." Ethan said nothing. The rifle, still resting on the sandbags with the unearthly scope catching the harsh Pacific sunlight, spoke for itself more eloquently than any words could. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, words spread through the Marine lines like electricity through copper wire. There was a shooter in the brotherhood pocket who could reach out and touch the enemy at distances that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of physics. The men who had laughed at Ethan Cole 24 hours earlier now treated him like a priest carrying holy relics. They spoke his name in hushed, reverent tones. They watched him walk past with a mixture of awe and something close to fear. But that same afternoon, a Marine interpreter who spoke fluent Japanese spent 2 hours questioning the prisoners who had walked out of the bunker complex. He came back to battalion headquarters with news that spread through the command structure faster than any radio transmission ever could. The Japanese had given Ethan a name, Akuma no Megane, the devil with glasses, and there was a formal reward posted. 1,000 yen for any information leading to the sniper's exact position. It was more money than most Japanese soldiers would see in an entire year of military service. More money than some of their families had ever possessed. Brennan took the news badly. His weathered face went pale under the layers of coral dust and old sweat. He grabbed Ethan by both shoulders hard enough to leave dark bruises that would last for weeks. They're hunting you specifically now, kid. Not just shooting at Americans. Hunting you. We need to move you constantly. Different positions every time. You never shoot from the same spot twice. You understand what I'm telling you? I understand, Sergeant. Do you? Because this isn't deer hunting back in Michigan anymore. This isn't target practice at some safe range in California. They're going to send everything they have to kill you specifically. Counter-snipers, artillery, maybe even aircraft if they can manage it. Ethan looked at the rifle resting against the sandbags. The unearthed scope was completely covered in thick soot and fine coral dust. He wiped the precious lenses with trembling fingers, checking obsessively for the hairline cracks that would end everything. None. The glass remained perfect. Impossibly miraculously perfect. The fragile toy had somehow survived another test that should have destroyed it. But Ethan understood something the others did not. He had crossed an invisible line today. He had moved from mere nuisance to genuine existential threat. From irritating sniper to something the enemy had no tactical answer for. And when an army has no tactical answer, it resorts to the oldest, most brutal solution in all of warfare: overwhelming human force. The mathematics had worked. The 800-yard shot had changed everything. But the equation was far from solved. And somewhere in the caves and ridges of Peleliu, other calculators were doing their own mathematics, making their own plans, preparing their own solutions to the problem of the devil with glasses. The war had noticed Ethan Cole, and the war was preparing to respond. Part 2. The Duel of Calculators. The morning of September 16th arrived with the same suffocating heat, but the battlefield had changed in ways that could not be measured with a thermometer or marked on a map. Ethan woke in the grey pre-dawn darkness with the same knot twisting in his stomach, the same tremor in his hands that only steadied when he wrapped his fingers around the worn walnut stock of the Springfield. He had killed 8 men yesterday. 8 confirmed kills, probably more that he could not verify because they had fallen behind cover or crawled away to die in the darkness of the caves. The numbers should have meant something. They should have felt significant. But they did not. They felt hollow and distant, like stones dropped into a deep well where you never hear them hit bottom. What mattered, the only thing that truly mattered, was that the mortars had stopped falling on his friends. Ethan was methodically cleaning the unearthed scope when the coral exploded exactly 6 inches from his head. The razor-sharp fragment sliced cleanly across his right cheek, opening a gash that immediately began streaming hot blood down his neck and soaking into his already filthy collar. The sound was completely different from anything he had heard before. Sharper, flatter, more precise. Not the heavy crack of a standard Type 99 Arisaka rifle, but something else entirely. Something designed specifically for this kind of work. Brennan grabbed Ethan by the shoulder and physically hauled him down below the protective lip of the trench with surprising strength for a man his age. "Counter-sniper, get down and stay down!" Corporal Silas Thornton, still manning his position 20 feet away, shouted across the broken coral. His voice was tight with fear. "That came from the second ridge, at least 800 yards out, maybe more." Ethan pressed his hand against the bleeding wound on his face and felt his heart hammering so hard in his chest he thought his ribs might crack. For the first time since he had arrived on this hellish island, someone had shot at him with the clear and deliberate intention of killing him specifically. Not random fire, not suppression, not blind luck. Someone had carefully calculated his exact position. Someone had done the mathematics. Someone had squeezed a trigger with Ethan Cole's name written on the bullet. Someone who thought exactly like him. Far away on that distant ridge, hidden in a carefully constructed hide that blended perfectly with the surrounding jungle, Captain Kenji Takahashi lowered his Type 97 sniper rifle and studied the American position through his inferior 2.5 power scope with intense concentration. Takahashi was 28 years old, a graduate of Tokyo University with an advanced degree in pure mathematics. Before the war, he had been a professor teaching calculus and differential equations to engineering students who would never use most of what they learned. When Japan desperately needed trained snipers, they had sent him to the Imperial Army Sniper School, where he quickly discovered that precision shooting was nothing more than applied mathematics with dramatically higher stakes. He had been watching the American sniper work for 2 full days now, studying his methods with academic interest, trying to calculate his next position, attempting to predict his patterns. The American was exceptionally good, better than good. He understood trajectory and wind drift and bullet drop. He made shots that should have been mathematically impossible given the equipment limitations. But he had one critical weakness that Takahashi had identified: his scope. Even from 850 yards away, Takahashi could see that massive tube mounted high above the receiver. It had to be at least 8 power magnification, possibly even 10. The American could see targets with crystal clarity that Takahashi could barely identify as human shapes with his vastly inferior 2.5 power Type 97 scope. But that tremendous advantage came with a corresponding disadvantage. The American had an extremely narrow field of view. He could only see what was directly in front of the crosshair. Everything else disappeared completely into the tunnel vision created by high magnification. Takahashi had missed his carefully calculated first shot by perhaps 4 inches. The American had shifted position at the last possible moment, some deeply buried animal instinct warning him of immediate danger. But now Takahashi had collected the critical data he needed. He knew the exact range. He knew the wind patterns. He knew how the American moved and thought. He began planning his next attempt with the methodical patience of a mathematician solving a complex proof. Back in the American lines, Ethan absolutely refused to move despite Brennan's increasingly desperate orders. He understood instinctively what the enemy sniper was doing right now. Calculating, planning, setting up the geometry for the next shot. If Ethan moved immediately, he would surrender the initiative completely. He would transform from hunter into prey. "Sergeant, I need you to trust me on this." "Kid, trusting you is precisely how I've managed to keep you alive this long." "Then trust me now." That sniper missed because I saw something at the very last second, a shadow in the wrong place, a color that didn't quite match. Something my brain recognized as dangerous before I consciously knew what it was. And what if your brain is wrong the next time? Then you get to say I told you so at my funeral. Brennan stared at him for a long, tense moment. Then he spat a stream of dark tobacco juice onto the white coral and grabbed his rifle with both hands. "Fine, but I'm spotting for you full time now. And if I see so much as a single leaf move wrong on that ridge, we're both getting out of here immediately. That's not a request. That's an order." "Understood, Sergeant." For the next full hour, Ethan and the invisible enemy sniper played an extraordinarily deadly game of chess across 850 yards of torn jungle and blasted coral. Neither could see the other clearly. Both knew with absolute certainty that the other was there. Calculating, planning, waiting with infinite patience for a single mistake that would end everything. Takahashi carefully set an elaborate trap. He ordered his men to construct a realistic dummy target exactly 50 yards to the left of his actual firing position. A complete Japanese uniform stuffed with rice straw propped up on a wooden stick behind a convincing pile of sandbags. From significant distance, it would appear to be an officer casually observing the battlefield through binoculars. Then he settled into his hide and trained his Type 97 rifle on the area where he confidently expected the American sniper to reveal himself. Through his scope, Ethan methodically scanned the distant ridge with the systematic patience his father had taught him during those frozen Michigan deer hunts. He spotted the Japanese officer almost immediately. The uniform was far too clean for someone who had been in combat for weeks. The posture was unnaturally stiff and rigid. The entire scene felt fundamentally wrong, like a painting where the perspective was subtly incorrect in ways your conscious mind could not quite identify. If he was setting a trap to kill another sniper, this is exactly what he would do. Exactly. Brennan peered through his binoculars at the distant ridge. "See that officer near that burnt palm tree standing like he's waiting for a bus? Perfect shot. Maybe 700 yards. Easy range for you now. It's a dummy target, a decoy." Brennan lowered the binoculars and looked at Ethan with surprise. "How can you possibly know that?" "Because that's precisely what I would do in his position. Put up a convincing decoy. Wait patiently for me to take the shot. Watch carefully for my muzzle flash." "Then shoot me while I'm working the bolt and can't move." Ethan slowly moved his crosshair away from the obvious dummy target and began systematically scanning the surrounding area with methodical care, looking for shadows that were too uniformly dark, rocks that were the wrong subtle color, vegetation that was arranged too deliberately in patterns nature would never create. There, approximately 50 yards to the left of the dummy, a small natural crevice in the weathered coral barely visible even with magnification. But the shadow pulled inside was darker than it should be, and there was a perfectly straight line visible where nature would have produced only irregular curves. He could just barely make out the edge of a rifle barrel protruding slightly from the darkness. "Found you," Ethan whispered so quietly that even Brennan, sitting right beside him, could barely hear. Through his own scope, Takahashi suddenly saw the massive American scope swing directly toward his position. The huge tube caught the bright sunlight for just a brief fraction of a second, creating a telltale glint. The American had seen completely through his carefully prepared trap. Both snipers realized simultaneously that they were now looking directly at each other across nearly 900 yards of empty tropical air. Both understood with perfect clarity that whoever fired first would immediately give away their exact position with muzzle flash and sound. But waiting also carried enormous risk, because the other might shoot first. It was a classic prisoner's dilemma, written in mathematics and imminent death. Ethan carefully placed his crosshair on the dark shadow where he calculated the enemy sniper's head should be positioned. His finger began applying steady pressure to the trigger. Takahashi placed his crosshair on the massive American scope that glinted like a mirror in the harsh sunlight. His finger tightened on his own trigger with equal determination. They fired within 0.3 of a second of each other. The two rifle reports echoed across the valley so close together in time, they sounded almost like one continuous sharp crack. Ethan's bullet struck the coral formation exactly 2 inches to the left of Takahashi's head, spraying the Japanese sniper's face with stinging limestone fragments that cut his skin and temporarily filled his eyes with blinding white dust. Takahashi's bullet hit the sandbag approximately 4 inches to the right of Ethan's exposed shoulder, missing him by the width of an average man's hand. Both men worked their bolt actions with frantic speed. Ethan fired again, perhaps half a second faster. This time he watched through his scope as the enemy rifle was violently knocked backward into the darkness of the cave, immediately followed by a distinct spray of dark blood across the white rock face. He had hit Takahashi somewhere in the upper body, probably the shoulder. Not immediately fatal, but absolutely fight-ending. Through the magnified glass, Ethan watched as the Japanese sniper crawled awkwardly deeper into his concealed hide, dragging his clearly wounded arm behind him, retreating into the relative safety of the extensive cave system that honeycombed the ridge. The duel of calculators was finished. Mathematics had decided the final outcome exactly as it always did. The difference between continued life and sudden death had been measured in 0.3 of a second and approximately 2 inches. The margin of error in war is measured in fractions so small they are almost incomprehensible to the human mind. Brennan slowly released a breath he felt like he had been holding for an entire hour. Is he dead? Wounded shoulder. I think he's completely out of the fight now. Good enough for me. But before either man could fully process what had just happened, the ground began to shake with a completely different kind of vibration. Something mechanical, something heavy, something that made your teeth rattle and your stomach turn over. Brennan's weathered face went from tan to pale grey in an instant. Tanks. They're sending armor. 2 Type 95 light tanks came grinding around the bend in the ridge road like mechanical demons emerging from hell itself. They were ugly, angular machines painted in faded yellow and brown camouflage that did nothing to hide their brutal purpose. Small compared to the massive American Sherman tanks, but against infantry with no anti-tank weapons, they were absolutely unstoppable. Their 37mm main guns swiveled mechanically, searching for targets. Their hull-mounted machine guns sprayed the American lines with sustained hatred. The infantry opened fire with everything they possessed. M1 Garrons pinged harmlessly off thick steel armor like thrown pebbles. Fragmentation grenades exploded uselessly against the heavy tracks. The tanks completely ignored the small arms fire and kept advancing with terrible mechanical inevitability. They were rolling directly toward the gap in the defensive lines, clearly intent on breaking through and overrunning the vulnerable command post. Ethan felt ice water replace the blood in his stomach. His rifle was completely useless here. A .30 caliber bullet against hardened tank armor was like throwing sand at a locomotive. He could possibly hit the driver's narrow vision slit, but that was a tiny rectangle of extremely thick glass, barely 2 inches wide, and both tanks were bouncing violently over the uneven terrain. Brennan was screaming desperately for a bazooka team, but the bazookas were gone, out of ammunition or destroyed or buried with their dead operators somewhere in the endless coral. Ethan watched the lead tank carefully. It was not completely buttoned up. The commander's hatch was standing open. A Japanese officer was visible from the chest up, standing in the turret and shouting into a radio headset. It was the same fatal arrogance the officers on the ridge had displayed. They genuinely believed the American infantry was completely suppressed and broken. They did not think anyone would be insane enough to take a shot at a moving tank with a bolt-action rifle designed for shooting stationary targets. But the immediate problem was violent movement. The tank was bouncing heavily over extremely uneven ground, lurching in unpredictable patterns. The commander's head bobbed up and down like a cork floating in rough water. Every time Ethan tried to track him, the narrow field of view of the high-power scope lost the target completely. He did something that made Brennan gasp audibly. He reached up and carefully adjusted the magnification ring on the unearthal scope, deliberately turning it down to reduce the power. The magnified image got noticeably smaller, but the field of view widened dramatically. Now he could see the entire tank in context. He could observe the rhythm of the violent bounce. Up, down, the suspension compressing heavily and then rebounding. He had to time the shot perfectly. Fire at the precise top of the bounce, that split second where the suspension hung momentarily in the air before crashing back down. Ethan led the moving tank, placing the vertical crosshair approximately 2 feet in front of the commander's face. He waited with forced patience as the tank climbed over a large pile of rubble. The nose pitched up sharply. The commander rose directly into the crosshair. Ethan fired. The bullet struck the commander in the side of the helmet with devastating force. The man disappeared into the turret instantly as if yanked down by an invisible cable. The tank immediately swerved violently to the left, crashing hard into a coral wall. The engine sputtered, coughed black smoke, and died. It sat there smoking and disabled. Finished. The second tank did not stop or slow down. It roared past its crippled partner, actually accelerating toward the Marine defensive lines. This commander had learned from watching his partner die. His hatch was sealed tight, completely buttoned up. A rolling steel coffin that was impossible to penetrate, 400 yards and closing fast. Ethan scanned desperately for any weakness. The armor was impenetrable to his rifle. The tracks were moving far too fast to hit reliably. Then he saw something most men would never have noticed. The gunner's vision optic. A small circle of glass mounted next to the main gun barrel, maybe the size of a tea saucer. If he could shatter that glass, the gunner would be completely blind. The tank would be reduced to nothing more than a blind battering ram. The tank was 300 yards away when the main gun fired. The heavy shell exploded against the trench wall just 10 feet from Ethan's position, showering him with dirt and burning hot shrapnel. Blood began trickling from his nose from the concussion pressure. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and settled back behind the rifle with grim determination. He placed the crosshair on the tiny glass circle and squeezed with steady pressure. The shot sparked brightly off the turret armor, a miss by perhaps 3 inches. Ethan worked the bolt frantically. The tank was 200 yards away now. Machine gun rounds were chewing up the sandbags all around his position. Brennan was firing his Thompson submachine gun in a completely useless gesture of pure defiance. Ethan fired again. This time white dust puffed exactly on the optic. The glass shattered into fragments. The turret immediately stopped its methodical rotation. The main gun froze, pointing uselessly to the right. Without functioning gun sights, the tank was reduced to a blind beast. Marines instantly swarmed it from multiple directions, jamming grenades into vision slits, throwing a heavy satchel charge onto the engine deck. The massive explosion rocked the entire valley. The second tank ground to a complete halt, burning fiercely. Ethan collapsed back against the trench wall. His entire body was trembling uncontrollably. The unearthal scope was covered in thick black soot, but incredibly the glass remained unbroken. The fragile toy had just helped kill 2 tanks. But the destruction of both tanks enraged the Japanese defenders in a way that rifle fire never could. Ethan had crossed an invisible psychological line. He had moved from mere nuisance to genuine existential threat, from irritating sniper to something the enemy had no tactical answer for. And when an army has no tactical answer, it resorts to the oldest, most brutal solution in all of warfare: overwhelming human force. The attack began with a sound that turned blood into ice water and made hardened veterans feel genuine primal fear. A sound that had terrified Marines on every Pacific island. Tenno Heika Banzai. The cry rose from the jungle floor like the voice of 1,000 demons screaming in unison. It started as a distant whisper, then built and grew to a deafening roar that echoed off the coral ridges and seemed to shake the very air. 10,000 voices screaming, "Long live the Emperor!" Brennan's face went absolutely white. He had heard this terrible sound before on other islands. He knew exactly what it meant. Banzai charge, fixed bayonets, human wave attack. The Marines frantically locked their long steel bayonets onto the ends of their M1 Garrons. They braced themselves against the trench walls. They knew what was coming. Hand-to-hand combat. Brutal, intimate, absolutely bloody. Ethan looked down at his Springfield rifle. It had a bayonet lug, but the thought of mounting a blade on a rifle with a 2-foot precision scope was completely insane. The vibration and impact of stabbing someone would instantly shatter the delicate optics. The rifle was too long, too heavy, too fragile for what was about to happen. He made a decision that felt like cutting off his own arm. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wrench he carried for the scope mounts. With trembling fingers, he carefully loosened the thumb screws that held his lifeline in place. He slid the unearthal scope off the rifle, feeling the substantial weight of it in his hands. 24 inches of precision glass and steel that had kept him alive for 2 days. He did not just carelessly toss it aside. He wrapped it in the canvas case with the same gentle care a mother might use wrapping a newborn infant. Then he shoved it deep under the heavy sandbags at the very bottom of the trench, burying it like precious treasure. Brennan watched him, understanding completely. "You going to be okay without it?" Ethan stood up slowly. He was just a rifleman now. a simple bolt-action rifle with primitive iron sights and 5 rounds in the magazine. He looked at Brennan and nodded with more confidence than he felt. My father fought the Germans without glass. I can do this too. The first wave of Japanese soldiers hit the defensive wire at a full dead run. The machine guns tore them apart with brutal efficiency, but more came behind, climbing over the bodies of the fallen. They were 50 yards away then, 30, then 10. Ethan fired his iron-sighted rifle as fast as he could, physically work the bolt. He dropped a charging man at 20 yards, another at 10. The rifle cracked against his shoulder again and again. Then the human wave crashed directly into the trench like a tsunami of flesh and steel. A Japanese soldier vaulted over the parapet and landed directly on top of Ethan with his full body weight. The impact drove all the air from Ethan's lungs. The soldier raised his rifle high to drive the bayonet straight down through Ethan's chest. Ethan brought the wooden stock of the Springfield up with desperate animal strength, smashing it hard into the man's jaw. The wood cracked audibly. The soldier fell backward. Ethan scrambled to his feet, working the bolt with frantic speed. He fired from the hip at point-blank range. The muzzle blast singed the enemy's uniform. The trench transformed into an absolute slaughterhouse. Men grappled in the mud, stabbing, gouging, screaming. There was no strategy here, no careful calculations, just the oldest, most primitive equation humans have ever known: kill or be killed. Ethan fought with pure animal desperation. He used the rifle as a club when there was no time to reload. He used his trench knife, a 6-inch blade that his father had carried through the trenches of France in 1918. He fought until his arms felt like dead weight and his lungs burned with each gasping breath. Brennan stayed close throughout, the big sergeant fighting like a demon possessed, protecting Ethan's exposed flanks. They fought back-to-back 2 men against an endless tide of violence. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the wave finally broke. The surviving Japanese soldiers retreated back into the smoke and jungle. The trench was filled with the dead and the dying. The living sat in stunned silence, covered in blood and white coral dust. Ethan collapsed onto an ammunition crate, gasping desperately for air. His knuckles were split and bleeding. His rifle stock was gouged and battered. He looked down at his shaking hands and watched them tremble uncontrollably. Then he suddenly remembered the scope. He dropped to his knees and began digging frantically through the heavy sandbags. Brennan helped him, both men throwing aside the bags until they found the canvas case. Ethan unwrapped it as carefully as if it were made of butterfly wings. The unearthly scope was there. Clean. Safe. Perfect. He held it up to the fading light with hands that would not stop shaking. The glass was crystal clear. The delicate spider silk crosshair was intact. Relief washed over him so powerfully that tears stung his eyes. Brennan sat down heavily beside him. A fresh bandage was wrapped around his head, already soaking through with blood. "You keep that thing safe, kid. We still have a lot of work to do." Ethan nodded silently. He carefully remounted the scope on the battered rifle, tightening the screws with hands that refused to stop trembling. He checked the alignment with obsessive care, still perfectly zeroed. The sun began to set over the Pacific Ocean, turning the entire sky blood red. Ethan had survived the duel with the Japanese mathematician. He had disabled 2 tanks. He had lived through the Banzai charge, but the killing was far from over. And somewhere in the extensive cave systems that honeycombed these ridges, Captain Kenji Takahashi sat with his wounded shoulder and thought about the American who had calculated faster than him. The war continued. The mathematics remained. And Ethan Cole, the devil with glasses, had 4 more days of calculations ahead of him. 4 more days of turning men into numbers. 4 more days of solving the terrible equations that war demanded. The scope was safe. The rifle was ready. And the mathematics never lied. September 17th faded into September 18th, and the killing continued with the mechanical efficiency of a factory production line. But something had changed in the way the other Marines looked at Ethan Cole. They no longer saw a college boy with a peculiar weapon. They saw something else entirely, something that made them uncomfortable in ways they could not quite articulate. They saw a young man who had reduced warfare to pure mathematics, who had turned human beings into ballistic problems, who could look at another person through 8-power magnification and see nothing but angles and trajectories and wind correction, and that frightened them more than the Japanese ever could. On the morning of September 19th, a Marine patrol captured Captain Kenji Takahashi while he was attempting to evacuate through the cave system. His right shoulder was shattered, the bone splintered by Ethan's bullet. He had lost a dangerous amount of blood and was running a fever that would probably kill him within 48 hours if he did not receive proper medical attention. They treated his wound and brought him to battalion headquarters for interrogation. The interpreter spent an hour with him in a tent that smelled of antiseptic and death. When he emerged, he carried words that would travel faster through the ranks than any radio transmission. A small group of officers had gathered to hear the report. Brennan stood at the back, his arms crossed, curious despite himself. The interpreter read from his notebook. Captain Kenji Takahashi, graduate of Tokyo University highest honors in mathematics, professor before the war, trained more than 50 Imperial Army snipers, 6 years studying ballistics. He paused as if uncertain he had translated correctly. He says the American calculated faster than him. Says the American thought 3 moves ahead. Says the American saw his trap before he finished setting it. The officers exchanged glances. This was unprecedented. A captured enemy officer praising an American sniper. Captain Takahashi says the American is highly educated in mathematics. He says you should be proud of him. When Brennan told Ethan later that afternoon, the young man was cleaning his rifle with the obsessive care of someone who trusted nothing else in the world. Math doesn't care about nationality, Sergeant. 2 + 2 = 4 in any language. Brennan studied him. The boy looked 10 years older than he had a week ago. The flesh had melted off his face, leaving sharp angles and hollow cheeks. His hands trembled constantly, except when they held the weapon. That Japanese professor respects you more than our own brass did 5 days ago. Ethan did not look up from the rifle. Respect doesn't bring back the dead. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of calculated violence. September 19th. The ridgelines were still crawling with Japanese defenders, but they had learned caution. They moved only in shadows, communicated through runners who stayed deep in the caves, stopped wearing rank insignia, but they still had to fight. And when they fought, Ethan could see them. 21 confirmed kills. A machine gun position at 740 yards, the gunner visible for exactly 4 seconds before Ethan's bullet found him. 2 observers in a concealed post at 680 yards, both eliminated before they could report marine movements. A mortar team that made the fatal mistake of setting up in daylight at 820 yards. Officers, NCOs, anyone who looked like they were coordinating fires or directing troops. Ethan moved positions constantly. Never more than 3 shots from the same location. The Japanese had artillery now specifically hunting him. Whenever he fired, he had less than 2 minutes to pack the rifle and relocate before shells started falling. September 20th. 18 confirmed kills. He was pushing the boundaries of what the manual said was possible. 940 yards, 1,000 yards. Shots that required him to aim so far above the target that he was lobbing bullets out of the sky like mortar rounds. The unearthly scope held. The glass stayed clear. The mounts stayed true. The sliding mechanism kept functioning despite heat and humidity and coral dust. It was a small miracle wrapped in German engineering and obsessive maintenance. September the 21st. 15 confirmed kills. But Ethan could feel himself breaking. His hands shook even when gripping the rifle. Food tasted like ashes. He had not kept a meal down in 2 days. Sleep came in 20-minute intervals, shattered by faces appearing in his crosshairs and refusing to disappear. 107 men. 107 calculations. 107 times he had reduced a human being to numbers on his forearm. Brennan found him vomiting behind the trench after forcing down half a can of sea rations. "You need to eat coal." "Trying, Sergeant." Brennan said nothing. He had seen this before. The cost was always paid one way or another. The currency was just different for each man. By evening of September 21st, Ethan had fired his last shot on Peleliu. The battle would grind on for 6 more brutal weeks. The 1st Marine Division would be chewed up by coral and caves. But something had changed in how they fought. When a patrol was pinned, they did not wait for artillery. They called for the calculator. And Ethan would appear, set up the long rifle with its massive scope and solve the problem. 1 shot or 20. But the problems got solved. In late October, when the division was finally pulled off the line, Ethan looked like a walking corpse. 23 pounds gone, eyes sunken, hands that never stopped shaking except when they held the Springfield. When the armorer took the rifle for processing, Ethan felt a physical pain in his chest. "Serial number 3928471. This one's got a history." Ethan could not speak. He walked away with empty hands, feeling naked. Brennan found him on the transport ship watching the island disappear. "You going to be okay?" Ethan stared at the ocean. Clean, blue, empty of death. "What do I do now, Sarge? I only know how to calculate killing." Brennan lit 2 cigarettes, handed one over. "You'll figure it out. You're the smartest man I ever met." He paused. "Your old man would be proud." Ethan returned to Hickory Corners in December 1944. There was a parade, a speech, a banner across Main Street. Ethan stood in dress blues with the silver star pinned to his chest and wanted to disappear. Someone in the crowd asked him what it was like to kill Japanese soldiers, to be a hero. Ethan excused himself and walked through the snow to the cemetery. The headstone was simple granite. William Cole, 1898 to 1942, Guadalcanal. Ethan knelt in the frozen ground, unpinned the silver star, placed it on the snow in front of his father's grave. "I finished the math, Dad. Used the glass like you said." His voice broke. "But the numbers have faces now, and I don't know how to make them go away." The wind carried snow through the bare trees. Ethan stayed until he could no longer feel his fingers. He tried college, University of Michigan, mathematics. But he could not sit in classrooms. Too many windows, too many angles. His mind calculated firing solutions for targets that did not exist. He lasted 1 semester. The lumber mill where his father had worked hired him. Cutting timber, operating saws, manual labor that silenced the nightmares during the day. The nights were different. The nights were when 107 faces came back. He met Lorraine Hayes in spring 1946. She worked at the post office. Auburn hair, kind eyes. A patience that did not ask questions when he woke up screaming. They married in June. Small ceremony at the Methodist church. On their wedding night, Ethan cried. The relief of being home, the guilt of surviving, the weight of 107 men who would never see home. Lorraine held him. "You're here now. That's what matters." 4 children came over the years. Ethan taught them mathematics at the kitchen table but never took them hunting. "I've done enough shooting for one lifetime." Korea came and went. Vietnam. Ethan watched young men with scoped rifles on the news. The technology improved. The math stayed the same. In June 1952, 2 Marines appeared at his door. "Corporal Cole, the Marine Corps needs you to train scout snipers. 3 weeks at Quantico. Not to fight, just to teach." Ethan, 28 but looking 40, shook his head. "I don't shoot anymore." "We don't need you to shoot, sir. We need you to teach them to think." After they left, Lorraine found him on the porch. "You should go." "I can't hold a rifle again." "Then hold a chalkboard." At Quantico, Ethan stood before 40 young Marines with chalk in his hand instead of a weapon. He wrote an equation on the board. Bullet drop at 800 yards, 70 degrees, 30% humidity, 10-mile-per-hour crosswind. Silence. "This is high school trigonometry." A young corporal spoke up. "Sir, we're Marines. We shoot, we don't calculate." Ethan set down the chalk, rolled up his sleeve. The faded pencil marks were still visible after 8 years. Ghosts of calculations made in combat. "I was a Marine too. I shot, but I calculated first." He pointed at the equation. "Every one of these numbers represents a Marine who went home. Every miscalculation is one who didn't." The room went quiet. "You think shooting is about courage? It's not. Courage is doing the math when you're terrified, then taking the shot anyway." He picked up the chalk. "Now someone solve this or we're staying here until you do." They learned. Slowly, but they learned. One Marine struggled more than the others, could not hit past 600 yards. After 3 days of failure, he approached Ethan. "Sir, I'm not good enough." Ethan looked at him, really looked, and smiled for the first time in years. "You think I was good? I was terrified every single shot." He showed his arm again. "But I did the math, and math doesn't shake, only we shake. Fear and accuracy can live together, you just have to trust the numbers." Letters came from Korea that winter. One in particular, "Made a 920-yard shot today, used your formula. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the rifle. But the math didn't shake. Thank you for teaching me that. You saved my life and my team. We made it home because of what you taught us." Ethan read it to Lorraine and understood something profound. He had given those young men his father's true gift, not just mathematics, but permission to be afraid and still function. Understanding that terror did not equal failure. The math was the constant, the rock to stand on when everything else was chaos. Years rolled on. Ethan worked the mill until retirement, raised his children, refused every interview about the war. To his neighbors, he was just the quiet man who could fix anything and calculate board feet faster than most men could write. In 1973, a letter came. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Brennan had died of a heart attack in Kentucky. Ethan cried reading it. First time Lorraine had seen him cry about the war in 29 years. "He saved my life more times than I could count, and I never told him thank you." "He knew," Lorraine said, Men like that always know. In 1995, Ethan took his grandson Tyler hunting. Tyler was 20. Ethan was 71, white-haired but steady-handed. They walked the same Michigan woods where Ethan had hunted with his father 57 years before. Tyler set up for a shot at 300 yards, a white-tailed buck at the clearing's edge. "Grandpa, you never shoot, you just watch." Ethan smiled. "I calculated enough for one lifetime. Now I observe." Tyler made the shot. Clean. Quick. The deer dropped. Ethan felt his father's presence like a hand on his shoulder. "Good math," he said quietly. "Your great-grandfather would be proud." Walking to the deer through frozen leaves, Ethan understood that his father's lesson was never about killing. It was about precision, about understanding that actions have consequences that can be calculated and controlled. The rifle was just a tool. The math was the legacy. June 12, 1998. Heart failure. Peaceful. No pain. Lorraine held his hand when he went. In his final moments, Ethan whispered numbers. Elevation. Windage. 800 yards. The same calculations from 54 years ago. Then his eyes cleared. "I see you, Dad. The math was right." His eyes closed. His breathing stopped. And Ethan Cole, the calculator who had turned mathematics into salvation, finally found peace. 3 days after the funeral, his family found a locked footlocker in the basement. Inside the silver star he had never worn after leaving it on his father's grave. A notebook of ballistics calculations, pages yellow with age, letters from Korean War snipers thanking him, a photograph of him and Brennan on Peleliu, both impossibly young, and a note in careful script: "The rifle is in the museum, serial 3928471. It was not mine. It belonged to the math. The math belonged to my father. I was just the one who remembered to carry the one." Today, in the National Museum of the Marine Corps, a display case sits in a quiet corner. Inside, a 1903 Springfield serial number 3928471. Mounted on top, a Unertl 8-power scope, 24 inches of glass still pristine after 80 years. Most visitors walk past. They want tanks and flamethrowers. But sometimes a young Marine stops, reads the placard, studies the scope. An older guard notices. He has seen this recognition before. "You know what minute of angle means, son?" "Yes, sir." "Cole held 5 MOA in 115-degree heat with people trying to kill him. 1944. With that." The young Marine leans closer. 107 confirmed kills. 7 days. September 15 through 21. 2 tanks disabled. 47 enemy surrendered. The guard's voice softens. "He didn't shoot to kill. He shot so someone else could live. That's the only calculation that mattered." The young Marine stands there a long time. Was he ever recognized? Silver Star. But he gave it away. Left it on his father's grave. Why? The guard thinks. Because men like Ethan Cole didn't fight for medals. They fought for the man next to them. Did the math so others could go home. When it was over, they went back to their lives and never talked about it. The museum closes. Lights dim. The rifle rests in its case. Silent. But somewhere in the eternal arithmetic of courage and sacrifice, William Cole still carries his Springfield through French trenches. Ethan Cole still peers through 8-power glass at a Japanese officer 800 yards away, writing calculations on his forearm, trusting mathematics when everyone saw only impossibility. And young Marines still learn that fear and accuracy can coexist, that courage is not absence of terror but willingness to calculate through it, that sometimes the difference between life and death is measured in fractions almost too small to comprehend. The rifle rests, the scope gleams, the legacy continues. For the next generation who will learn that mathematics is the difference between coming home and staying forever in white coral on some distant island. The equation is solved, and the numbers, as always, never lie.